Howdy partner, you're watching Killer Bites, a true crime cooking show where we explore the minds of criminals while experimenting with the flavors of plant-based dishes. In today's episode, I'm going to tell you about the Harpe Brothers while making a burrito. If you'd like to cook with me, the recipe is in the description below. Today we're throwing it back to the late 1700s to learn about the first documented serial killers in the United States, the Harpe Brothers. The duo consisted of Joshua Harper, or Micaiah Big Harpe, and William Harper, or Wiley Little Harpe. Now, these dudes were actually cousins who pretended to be brothers for whatever reason, and they traveled all around Kentucky, Illinois, Mississippi, and Tennessee, taking the lives of innocent people in extremely horrific ways. To assemble the burritos, I'm going to start off with a tortilla and add in beans, rice, lettuce, chili and tomatoes, corn, and a spice mixture. The first crimes committed by the Harpe brothers most likely took place sometime around the American Revolution. Reports say the men joined a loyalist group that partook in many terrible things like violating women, stealing, burning buildings, destroying things, and executing people. Yeah, instead of actually fighting in the war, they were just running around and tormenting the patriots. One time, a man named Captain James Wood caught Wiley trying to force himself on a woman. The captain fired at Wiley, but the bullet didn't knock him out cold and he survived. Well, the Harpe brothers must have believed in revenge and had each other's backs because they ended up abducting Captain Wood's daughter, Susan. They also took another woman named Maria Davidson who, for whatever reason, went by the name Betsy. How do you get Betsy from Maria? That's a big jump. So let's fast forward to the Battle of Yorktown, which the Brits won, signifying the end of the American Revolution. Didn't think you'd be getting a history lesson today, did you? The Harpe brothers had made friends with the Chickamauga Cherokee, so they decided to live with them in their village in Nickajack, Tennessee. The Chickamauгans had a lot of hatred for these new settlers, rightfully so, which led them to start raiding their settlements. Now, even though the Harpe brothers didn't really have the same trauma, they decided to join the Chickamauгans. Together, the group would go into these white settlements in Tennessee and Kentucky to steal food and valuables, brutalize women, and slay families. Wow. America was a free-for-all back then. This is wild. During one of their raids is when the Harpes snatched up Susan and Betsy to make them their wives and also get revenge on Captain Wood. Betsy and Susan each got pregnant twice, although it's not clear which Harpe brother was the baby daddy. Regardless, when the women gave birth, Micaiah and Wiley would execute the newborns. In September of 1794, the Harpe brothers somehow found out that the Patriots were planning to ambush the Native American settlement at Nickajack. The Harpe brothers packed up their things, took their captive lady wives, and skipped town. But want to know something awful? I guess the selfish Harpes decided not to warn their Chickamaugan friends because they were completely surprised by the attack and it absolutely destroyed their town. Meanwhile, the Harpes were just chilling at a new camp in the area, getting all of their food and necessities by raiding other people's homes and farms. In 1797, they moved to a cabin near Knoxville and it seemed like their violent streak was finally over. The men got into hog farming, Micaiah officially married Susan, and Wiley found a nice minister's daughter named Sarah. As for Betsy, Micaiah took her in as a second wife because that's just the kind of dude he was. Even though the Harpe brothers may have tried turning a new leaf, they just couldn't suppress their criminal impulses. So on the down low, Micaiah and Wiley started stealing animals from people's farms around town. At first, their act went unnoticed, but the more livestock that went missing, the more frequently the Harpe brothers would show up at the butcher with pork to sell. As people in town started to piece things together, they realized that the Harpe brothers were the ones stealing the animals. But anytime someone tried to confront the brothers, Micaiah and Wiley would just slay them. Wow, these guys have terrible problem-solving skills. Actually, they're non-existent. Also, I love how they're like, oh, you're gonna accuse us of crimes we most definitely committed? How dare you? One guy named Johnson went up to Micaiah and Wiley in a tavern to talk to them about their thievery, and a fight broke out. During the scuffle, Johnson jabbed Wiley with a blade, but it honestly wasn't that bad of a wound. Well, the Harpes left the tavern and Johnson decided to stay and hang for a bit. Much to his surprise, the Harpes were still there. They were just waiting out front for Johnson to leave. And when he did, the Harpes pounced on him, dragged him to the woods, and ended his life for good. Days later, Johnson was found floating in a nearby river in rough conditions. But by that point, the Harpe crew had already dipped. They journeyed on to Kentucky, but along the way they had to whack a handful of people, of course. In December of 1978, the Harpe brothers robbed and executed a peddler. They also hit two fellow travelers with bullets. Once the brother cousins knew both victims were gone for good, they robbed them of their things. I don't understand why the Harpes just can't rob their victims and leave it at that. There's really no need for them to end their lives too. Rumor has it all of the Harpes' victims would be found in a similar manner. While the Harpes seem to have spent most of their time traveling around sleeping in makeshift camps, as the winter weather of 1798 got worse, they made the decision to stay at a Kentucky inn. One morning, they walked into the inn with their three wives, and I think all of them were pregnant at this point. I wonder if they knew whose baby was whose this time. The whole gang looked super rough and scraggly, and one of the inn guests and fellow travelers named John Lingford noticed them. He decided to be welcoming and generous by buying them all breakfast. The Harpes took John up on his offer and made mental note that he must have some serious dough to be paying for strangers like that. Over time, the three men became close pals, but the Harpe brothers had ulterior motives. What's new? They encouraged John to come with them on Wilderness Road because there were some bad people out there and it wasn't smart to travel alone. John was all like, "That's so sweet of you to offer. Thanks for looking out for me." Somewhere along their trek, the devious duo snuffed John. Local authorities began investigating the case and traced John back to the Kentucky Inn, where an employee and several other witnesses reported seeing John leave with the Harpe posse. On Christmas Day in 1798, officials caught the Harpes and threw them in jail. But not just the brothers, their pregnant wives too. Now, I'm not really sure how secure jails were back in the day, but the Harpe brothers managed to escape in March of 1799, and it was back to the same old criminal. But they left their ladies behind. Have I mentioned how much I hate these dudes? Well, while the Harpe women awaited their trial, all three of them gave birth in jail. Which sounds kind of bad, but it's better than them giving birth in the presence of Micaiah and Wiley, who had terminated several of their babies at that point. At their trial, the Harpe women pleaded not guilty and were acquitted. Not only that, but they were given a horse by the city so they could return home to their families. But the Harpe women sold the horse and used that money to buy a canoe that they took down the Ohio River with their babies on board. They rode to a meetup spot along the river that they somehow planned out with Micaiah and Wiley. I wish I could go back in time and tell these women that they're too good for their husbands. Even though I feel like the women were victims, I do want to point out that some people view them as accomplices to Micaiah and Wiley. Whatever the dynamic was, the unique brother, cousin, husband, wife group traveled north in an attempt to escape the law. On the way, the Harpe brothers took the lives of 5 men over the course of 2 weeks and just casually continued on their way up to Cave and Rock in southern Illinois. The criminals were being followed closely by a vigilante group, but unfortunately the group stopped right before Cave and Rock. One day, the Harpes met this group called the Samuel Mason Gang, who Wikipedia describes as river pirates and highwaymen. The Harpes really vibe with the river pirates, so they ended up hiding out with them and participating in their boat raids and other shenanigans. But the brothers were still committing lewd, life-ending acts on their own, so they were kicked out of the group. Dang. You know it's bad when pirates think you're too violent. After that, the Harpes journeyed to East Tennessee and continued adding victims to their list. We know all of this because the victims were all found in a similar state. Let's just say those Harpe boys really stayed on brand with the whole rocks and stomach situation. As if you can't tell how ruthless the Harpes were, wait until you hear this. One day, Micaiah got so annoyed by his baby daughter crying that he smashed her head into a tree, which instantly caused her demise. Trust me, I didn't want to have to tell you that, but it's a part of the story. That same month, the Harpes were welcomed at the Stiegel home, where they iced one of the other overnight guests. They also snuffed the owner's 4-month-old son because he was crying. When its mom screamed for obvious reasons, she was also whacked by the Harpes. Basically, Micaiah and Wiley just kept traveling around, tricking people, snuffing them, and taking their money. They truly set the bar high for the term serial killer. So by now, there was a huge group of people who wanted to see Micaiah's and Wiley's heads on a chopping block. And I don't mean that in a metaphorical sense. It's not clear if this posse included any of the same people from the previous search groups, but I do know the recently widowed and child-robbed Mr. Stiegel was a member. On August 24th, 1799, the posse located the Harpe brothers and ordered them to surrender. The duo was able to get away, but one of the vigilantes hit Micaiah in the leg and back with bullets. Not long after that, the posse caught up to Micaiah and ripped him off his horse. He fell to the ground and was too weak to get up. In Micaiah's final moments alive, he confessed to slaying 20 people. As for Wiley, he got away and met back up with the Samuel Mason gang. He rejoined the group and flew under the radar under the alias John Sutton. 4 years later, a reward was posted for the head of their leader, Samuel Mason. Wiley and a fellow pirate named James decided to take advantage of this opportunity and get that reward. They executed Samuel Mason and presented his head, but officials didn't recognize them as outlaws, so they were arrested instead. Wiley and James were sent to prison where they both escaped, but were caught and brought back. Sheesh. They didn't think to crack down on their jail security after the first Harpe brother breakout. The 2 men went to trial and were sentenced to be hung. As gruesome as the situation was, the Harpe brothers' slaying saga had finally come to an end. The 3 Harpe women all faced charges for being accessories to their husbands' crimes, but were eventually released. Now I'm gonna add sour cream and cilantro for garnish. Sally and Betsy both remarried and had more children with husbands who actually treated them well. Susan seemed to have stayed single, and I don't blame her one bit. A lot of Harpe family members ended up changing their names because they didn't want to be affiliated with the terrible crimes committed by Micaiah and Wiley. The duo is theorized to have slain at least 40 people. At first, it seemed like they committed these acts for money, but over time it was apparent these men were much more demented than that. Some reports say the Harpes watched their families get attacked and lynched by patriots and swore from that day they'd get revenge. And I understand the revenge thing to an extent, but I feel like the Harpes took it way too far. Just because they experienced something terrible, that doesn't give them a right to do even worse things to innocent people who also have families. Think about poor Mr. Stiegel. He didn't deserve to lose his wife and kid that day. Here's my conclusion. The Harpe brother cousins were awful people who got away with some of the most heinous crimes I've ever heard of. They were violent, misogynistic, and hateful humans who didn't set a good example for the future of our country. As for me, I choose to advocate for a positive, accepting, and non-violent future where there is an abundance of plant-based burritos. Who's with me? Thanks for watching.